Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Chapter 4 in our Democracies at War lectures. So we'll have a look today at Operation Iraqi Freedom. We saw last week when we listed the 7 wars fought by Western liberal democracies since the end of the Cold War that twice America, leading a more or less important coalition, went to war against Saddam Hussein in 1990, 1991, Operation Desert Storm, after Iraqi's invasion and the occupation of Kuwait, and once again in 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom. I will have a look today at Operation Iraqi Freedom. Why? For the very simple reason that it very concretely, very empirically illustrates many of the general points that I alluded to in the preceding chapters and that I will deepen in the next chapters. That is to say, the absence of any somehow credible threat upon the national security of Western states, and in this case of the United States. The importance of specific groups exerting some pressure in order for wars to be fought. The resort to corporate warriors, supplementing professional armies, and regarding the decision-making process, the absence of any kind of somehow significant pluralist debate as regards the necessity or not to go to war. And I would like to start today's analysis with very quickly summing up the differences between Operation Desert Storm 1991 and Operation Iraqi Freedom 2003, also together, of course, emphasize the specificities of Operation Iraqi Freedom in the major part of today's lecture. So, at first sight, the two wars are similar or are characterized by pretty similar characteristics. They were fought by the same statesman, or almost the same statesman, Saddam Hussein on the one hand, George Bush father, and George Bush son on the other hand. They were waged by the same protagonists, or almost the same protagonists. Iraq on the one hand, almost universally isolated, versus a coalition headed by the United States of America, a huge coalition regarding Operation Desert Storm, a more limited coalition as regards Operation Iraqi Freedom. And both wars ended with the same result, that is to say, a victory for the US troops, a defeat of Saddam Hussein's regime, although the political consequence of the two wars were different. Saddam Hussein did not lose his power in 1991. He was ousted from power in 2003, had to hide himself before being caught in, I think it was in December 2003, and sentenced to death, hanged on the gallows pole on December 2006. So very, at first sight at least, many very similar points, but of course there are significant differences, fundamental differences. If we can sum up these differences, we can say that we have on the one hand a defensive multilateral war, and on the other hand an offensive unilateral war. Regarding the legal framework of both operations, the decision to launch Desert Storm in 1991 was adopted within the legal framework of a UN Security Council's resolution, that is to say, in accordance with Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which prohibits any kind of offensive war, which allows only defensive wars. And very specifically, very precisely, the UN Security Council met as early as on August 2, 1990, that is immediately after Kuwait's invasion by Iraqi troops. The Kuwaiti government appealed to the UN Security Council, which adopted a resolution determining that there was a breach of international peace and international security. A second resolution, a breach of peace because of an act of aggression, of course. A second resolution was adopted a bit later in September, deciding to take measures not involving the use of force, that is to say, the UN Security Council, but on economic sanctions, inciting, convincing Saddam Hussein to withdraw his troops. This, however, did not work, and therefore the UN Security Council adopted a new resolution, Resolution 678, adopted on November 29, 1990. It considers this resolution, the United Nations Security Council recognized that these measures short of violence had not, I quote, had proved to be inadequate, had not proven adequate, and therefore this resolution allowed all the member states of the UN eager to do so to resort to such, I quote, actions by air, sea, and land forces in order to do what? In order to permit Kuwait to recover its violated sovereignty, thus re-establishing international peace and security, which is the aim of the UN since its creation in 1945. And this UN resolution, since it was adopted by all the members, or at least there was no veto, neither by the then still existing Soviet Union nor by China, this operation was implemented under the name Desert Storm by the US, all its major Western allies, and also some Arab states. And hidden, we have a very significant difference with Operation Iraqi Freedom. It was undertaken without any formal authorization from the UN Security Council, and also against the explicit opposition of some of America's most important allies, first and foremost France and Germany. France had promised that it would use its power to block the resolution thanks to a veto, thus joining the Russians and the Chinese. The coalition then that was established by the US was the so-called coalition of the willing, including notably the British, some other members of NATO, notably the Netherlands and Central European members, and different states, minor powers from the global south. So unilateralism prevailed also within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and not merely within the UN. So a unilateral as opposed to a multilateral operation. And regarding the underlying logic of the two operations, the aims pursued, the objectives that the US tried to satisfy, Operation Desert Storm aimed at restoring the status quo, that is to say, to re-establish the violated sovereignty of Kuwait. The aim was not to put an end to Saddam Hussein's regime. So it was basically a defensive war. The aim was to defend international law, of course, and a more obviously down-to-earth reason inciting the US to intervene, of course, was the defense of the regional stability and the stability of the oil market, important, of course, for the Western world's economic wealth. Being a defensive move overall, we can say, if we apply Alexander Wendt's framework, we can say that this Operation Desert Storm was a lock-in undertaking, as opposed, therefore, to the Hobbesian nature of Operation Iraqi Freedom, the aim was to overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime, to transform Iraq into a democracy, a Western-style, American-style liberal democracy, in order to permit American values to be spread in the Middle East region, thus hoping to some extent that the whole Middle East Arab countries may become democracies too. Ops and logic, so underpinning this operation. Why? Because though the national independence of Iraq was not at stake, its political sovereignty was at stake. The aim was to establish a new regime controlled, of course, by the Americans. So an offensive war, and if we take all these differences together, we can say that Operation Desert Storm was a war of necessity, at least from an international relations theory's perspective, while Operation Iraqi Freedom was a war of choice. It was a war of choice, ladies and gentlemen, and I now come to the details of Operation Iraqi Freedom itself, because the argumentation put forward by George Bush's administration to justify its decision to launch Operation Iraqi Freedom, this argumentation was refuted by the empirical reality. According to George Bush, according to his administration, Operation Iraqi Freedom was necessary to do what? To guarantee America's security, either directly or indirectly, that is to say, to guarantee the security of America's allies in the Middle East, from Israel to Saudi Arabia. Guarantee their security against a rogue state guilty, of course, of having aggressed in the past various of its neighbors, which is true. Iran in 1980, Kuwait in 1990. A regime guilty of having attacked its neighbors, guilty of possessing weapons of mass destruction, and of aiming at acquiring the weapon of mass destruction, that is to say, nuclear weapons, and also guilty of sponsoring terrorist networks such as Al-Qaeda, which had staged the terrorist attacks of 9/11. So listen to George Bush in one of his many speeches held during roughly the 6 months preceding Operation Iraqi Freedom in March 2003. Listen to Bush: America cannot permit a brutal dictator with a history of reckless aggression, with ties to terrorism, with great potential wealth, to dominate a vital region and threaten the US. America cannot permit Saddam Hussein to threaten the US. Iraq, I go on quoting, possesses ballistic missiles with a likely range of hundreds of miles, far enough to strike Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, and other nations in the region where 135,000 American civilians and American service members, troops, are living and working. 135,000 Americans are, to some extent, a prospective target for Saddam Hussein. It's weapons of mass destruction. Next argument: Iraq and Al-Qaeda, the Al-Qaeda terrorist network, share a common enemy, the US. We know that Iraq and Al-Qaeda have had high-level contacts that go back a decade, to the beginning of the 1990s. Remember, in 1993, a first attack had taken place in the basement of the World Trade Center. I think 6 people had been killed. A truck had exploded in the basement. Some Al-Qaeda leaders, I come back to my quote, who fled Afghanistan after Operation Enduring Freedom in 2001, after the Taliban regime had been overthrown by this Operation Enduring Freedom. Some Al-Qaeda leaders who fled Afghanistan went to Iraq And Saddam Hussein aids and protects these terrorists. He tries, last argument, to acquire weapons of mass destruction, technologies suitable for nuclear weapons production. And he thus came to the conclusion, a sentence which is pretty often quoted, the overlap between states that sponsor terror and states that pursue weapons of mass destruction compels America to action. We cannot but act because of this kind of unprecedented threat emanating from Saddam Hussein, who all at once sponsors terrorist networks and who possesses weapons of mass destruction likely to strike the US or its allies. And Colin Powell, his Secretary of State, in February 2003, so 5 to 6 weeks before Operation Iraqi Freedom was launched, backed up these accusations with satellite pictures, with tape recordings during his address at the UN Security Council. Ladies and gentlemen, the arguments put forward by George W. Bush, are compatible with the democratic peace theory that we saw last week. The dyadic version, of course, of the democratic peace theory. Remember, we saw this: democracies cannot trust non-democratic leaders, brutal dictators with a history of reckless aggression, to quote George Bush. We saw last week that, according to Michael Doyle, democracies go on feeling threatened by autocratic states. And Bruce Rosset ascribes this perception to the absence of any kind of mutually shared peaceful expectation. There can be no such a peaceful expectation in a relationship between a democracy and an autocracy. What's more, George Bush's argumentation somehow is compatible with Kenneth Waltz's neo-realist analysis, according to which the first aim that states cannot but pursue on the international scene is their security. Remember, Kenneth Waltz, security is the highest end that anarchy incites and even compels the states to look for on the international scene. And in order to do so, in order to obtain security, states cannot but rely on a self-help policy. Self-help, to some extent, means unilateral. To act unilaterally, you only can bet on yourself. You cannot rely on somebody else, even a close ally. So at first sight, the arguments put forward by George Bush may be corroborated by two of the then and still nowadays major IR approaches. However, unfortunately, for the Bush administration, American realists themselves rejected these argumentation. The best and the brightest American realists and neo-realists, Kenneth Waltz, Stephen Walt, John Mearsheimer, Robert Jervis, Robert Pape, Barry Posen, etc., published in September 2002, so roughly 6 months before Operation Iraqi Freedom was launched, a full page in the New York Times entitled "War with Iraq is not in America's national interest." So they start, of course, summing up the realist analysis of wars as sometimes necessary to advance a state's national interests. They go as far as saying that the US should not stop short from invading Iraq in the case it would threaten to attack either America or its allies, but they immediately specify, they emphasize that this precisely is not the case. War with Iraq does not meet this standard. and therefore war with Iraq is not in America's national interest. The argumentation put forward by the realists was proven right. A little bit later, that is to say, when American troops, once in Iraq, found, of course, no nuclear weapon whatsoever, neither did they find any intercontinental missile likely to hit the American territory, or even intermediate range missiles likely to hit Israel or Saudi Arabia. This was due, of course, to the sanctions that had been imposed upon Iraq after the war of 1991. Needless to say, ladies and gentlemen, no proof of whatever link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein was found by the Bush administration. To put it differently, it is impossible to propose a realist analysis of the causes of Operation Iraqi Freedom, since realists themselves reject any explanation founded on the realist approach. We therefore have to look for an alternative environment. And since realists ascribe wars to international causes, to factors located on the international scene, logically, we have to look at the domestic scene. We have to look for an alternative explanation, locating the major explanation of the decision to launch Operation Iraqi Freedom in the domestic setting of the states that decided to go to war, that is to say, the United States. And this then is what I will be doing in proposing an analysis of Operation Iraqi Freedom as a sinister war fought first in order to satisfy the interests, the particular private interests of a specific minority within the US, sinister interests as opposed to the national interest. A sinister war because launched by a president who can be considered as a kind of spokesperson of a coalition of bellicose members who profited from the terrorist attacks of 9/11, which became a kind of window of opportunity that they used in order to implement their plan, we come back to this, to attack and to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And the war, third major point, made possible because of, or thanks to, the absence of any kind of credible checks and balances within the American democracy. That is to say, neither the media nor the Democrats, the opposition in Washington, played their role as a somewhat critical voice likely to permit a democratic controversy to emerge. Plural and pluralist debates should characterize liberal democracies. The underlying framework to which I will resort is Jack Snyder's analysis put forward first in a book, Myths of Empire, which is a book that goes back to 1991, and which he somehow applied in a very short article, Imperial Temptations, published at the eve of Operation Iraqi Freedom in the spring issue of the magazine The National Interest. Imperial Temptation. Jack Snyder is a classical, is a realist scholar, but he introduces domestic factors, as you can see in the subtitle of his book, Domestic Politics and International Missions. So it comes very close to a neoclassical realist framework, which is basically the one that underlies my whole lectures as I tried to sum up in chapter 2. So, Myths of Empire, that is to say, Imperial Temptations, that is to say, I will propose an analysis of Operation Iraqi Freedom as a sinister war or as an imperialist war. So let's come to the concept of imperialism, which is a concept used by many IR scholars, including by classical realists such as Morgenthau, or Renoir for Morgenthau. an imperialist policy is opposed to a status quo policy, so it's kind of a revisionist policy in general, foreign policy. For Aron, in his Peace and War, an imperialist war is a war. An imperialist foreign policy is a policy aiming at conquering foreign units to submit their populations. There is a very well-known critical approach of imperialism. It goes back to the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. The Norwegian Johan Galtung and his peace research approach proposed a structural theory of imperialism. He used this concept to explain, to account for the underdevelopment of the then third world countries, unable to develop because as a periphery they were structurally dominated and exploited by the imperialist core of the world economy. And as regards imperialism as a specific cause of war, the most important authors, I think, classical authors, that is to say before Snyder, were, of course, Lenin, who proposed a Marxist approach of imperialism, and two contemporary authors of Lenin, John Hobson, liberal authors. John Hobson with his imperialism study, and the Austrian Joseph Schumpeter in his imperialism and social classes. These three authors propose an analysis of imperialism defined as a policy of military expansion with a view at exerting a political control over the conquered territory to the agree upon the objectives pursued by imperialism. They also agree upon the basic explanation. This imperialist behavior is due to domestic variables, to domestic interests. The important difference, however, is that according to Lenin, these domestic interests are inherently characterizing capitalism, while according to Hobson and Schumpeter, these domestic interests are actually the interests of a small minority of social actors. So let's have a look at the three authors, and let's start with Lenin, whose approach was very successful when I was a student. According to Lenin, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. Why? Because of what the Marxists call the falling profit rate of capitalism. That is to say, the more capitalism expands, the less it will be profitable. That is to say, there is a relative decline of the profit rate due to capitalist accumulation. And so in order to escape this law, what do capitalist firms have to do? They first merge into larger units, thus creating trusts or monopolies. These were the terms used. And then they search for new markets. They search for new markets, both to find less expensive raw materials as inputs in their production, but also to find new consumers to export their goods. And these new markets, according to Lenin, existed in the then colonial territories, which meant that the different capitalist powers, and notably the European ones, were committed in a race towards conquering more and more territories in order to somehow escape the law of the falling growth rates. And logically, they became rivals overseas. And Wilbur Weld then, according to him, is the logical consequence of these rivalries among major European powers who were doomed to try to find new colonial territories. And they aimed at protecting them against rival European colonial powers or capitalist states, and they tried to conquer new ones detrimentally to these other colonial rivals. So World War One, according to Lenin, is a war of conquest, I quote, and a war of plunder, opposing rival imperialist powers, Great Britain, France, Germany, and Russia, struggling to divide the world in order to find zones of investment for their finance capital. Lenin's theory is hardly corroborated by the empirical reality. First of all, the two major colonial rivals were France and Great Britain. Now they happen to be within the same coalition, the same alliance, the Triple Entente, together with Russia against Germany. Germany indeed had colonial ambitions, which to some extent threatened the then colonial status quo, favorable notably to the British and the French. But the French and the British were rivals themselves. The British and the Russians were rivals in Central Asia. These rivalries did not prevent them from establishing an alliance to fight against Germany, which amounts to saying that World War I can hardly be ascribed to the colonial rivalries. All the more so, or all the less so, actually, since when we look at the concrete importance, economic importance of the colonial markets, what do we see? We see that the British capitalists did not invest first and foremost in their colonial territories overseas. They first and foremost invested in the United States of America. France was not the first investor in its own, notably African colonies. And last but not least, the idea of a kind of falling growth rate of capitalism, characterizing capitalism, the typical Marxist idea. Well, 100 years later, capitalism is still alive and well. So maybe there is a falling growth rate, or profit rate, sorry, a falling profit rate of capitalism. But there is no, or at least there has been until now, no final capitalism crisis yet, and therefore the Marxist analysis as a whole is hardly credible. Lenin was influenced by, though he transformed into his Marxist approach, of course, he was influenced by the first book that had been published on imperialism, the one by John Hobson, Imperialism, a study that had been published in 1902. And here then we have a liberal version of imperialism, somehow close to Lenin, which explains why Lenin used it, though transforming it into his Marxist theory. The book was published in 1902, that is to say, immediately after the war that the British fought in South Africa, so-called Anglo-Boer War against the Dutch settlers, the Boers, who wanted to become independent. The British wanted to maintain its colony in what roughly corresponds to today's South Africa. So the analysis of Hobson is the following one. The British economy, according to him, he was a friend of Keynes, became a friend of Keynes, both influenced the establishment of welfare capitalism, welfare state, etc., which became characteristic of Western economies after World War II, so significantly later than this book. According to Hobson, there was a crisis in the British economy at the end of the 1890s. Due to what? Due to the tendency of British capitalists to underpay their workers. They underpaid the working class in order to maintain high profit rates. But since the workers were underpaid, the consequence was an underconsumption. As you say, they did not have enough purchasing power to buy the products. So there was a crisis of overproduction. And since there was a crisis of overproduction, no need, it was useless. There was no reason for capitalists to invest. So they were exceeding, because they were already too many goods that were produced and that were not purchased by the British. So there was an exceeding saving capacity, surplus capital is the term used. So the British capitalists were looking for a way out of this crisis. They could have and they should have, according to Hobson, increased the wages paid to the working class, but they refused to do so. A typical aristocratic mentality, according to Hobson, they prefer to maintain their profit rate rather than to share their welfare with the working class. So they looked for another solution, and they found the solution in conquering new markets in order to sell the existing overproduction overseas. To put it differently, they exerted pressure upon the British government to conquer new colonies and the more so to keep under British control the already existing British colonies. And they thus exerted the pressure in order for the British government to fight a war against the Boers who wanted to become independent in the southern part of the African continent. So an argumentation pretty close to Lenin, the difference being the one that I already summed up some minutes ago. According to Lenin, the conquest of new territories, of new markets is inherent in capitalism, and according to Hobson, it is due to the specific action of a small minority of specific capitalists who are driven more by aristocratic mentality than by a genuine bourgeois or capitalist mentality. So imperialism and the wars fought as imperialist war, according to Hobson, are due to the specific interests of a minority of societal actors. Listen to Hobson, the business interests of the nation as a whole are subordinated to those of certain sectional interests who usurp the control of national resources and use them for their private gain. It is private gain which pushes these groups to exert pressure upon the governments to fight the colonial wars. Imperialism, though irrational from the standpoint of the whole nation, has been a good business for certain classes, we would say certain groups, within the nation. These groups profit from the wars, from the preparations for this war, from the political climate which will prevail in the British society and during the war. And the same vision will be shared a bit later in 1919 by Joseph Schumpeter, who wrote after Lenin's book, that had been published in 1917. Joseph Schumpeter used as an example World War I. Schumpeter was a hardcore liberal sociologist or economist or philosopher. As a liberal scholar, he considered capitalism to be a force for peace, for the very simple reason that, according to him, capitalists are interested in being able to predict the future, to maintain regular profits based on expectations that can be rationally anticipated. Therefore, a war which upsets existing trends is not in the rational interest of capitalists, though they may permit very short-term profits to emerge. But on the long run, it is not rational for the successful working of capitalism and therefore for long-term profits of capitalist firms. How then does Schumpeter explain the outbreak of World War I? Well, he ascribes it to once again, a minority of actors, but not of capitalist nature, capitalist origin, but he considers that World War I was the war desired by a specific minority of German and more specifically Prussian aristocrats. The Prussian aristocratic landowners, Junkers is the German name, who also controlled the army. The Prussian army, ladies and gentlemen, had been established after the 30 Years' War, after the Westphalian Peace. Prussia at that time, or part of Prussia, was occupied by Sweden. And to expel the Swedish troops, the then Prussian, the King, Frederick I, established the first the Prussian army based on the then aristocratic class. And it is this Prussian army very successful from the second half of the 17th up to the end of the 19th century, which permitted German unification. So in the past, according to Schumpeter, the Prussian army had a raison d'être. Its existence was rational and useful. But this was no longer the case, according to him, at the eve of World War I, because of the economic interdependence, which makes wars irrational, counterproductive. So according to Schumpeter, given that the Russian landowners who formed the majority of the advisors of the now German king of Imperial Germany, Wilhelm II, William II, given that these landowners were afraid of losing their social privileges because they were no longer useful, given that wars to some extent were obsolete, they invented a war. They exerted a pressure upon the emperor in order to convince him to wage this war, because this war would permit the class concerned of the aristocratic Prussian Junkers to once again be the savior of the nation. So Schumpeter and Hobson, beyond their differences, agree in explaining imperialist wars as wars due to what we may call the parochial, the private, the sinister interests of a small minority of societal actors, specific capitalists for Hobson, aristocratic landowners for Schumpeter. The examples, of course, are somehow exceptional. The Anglo-Boer War, the World War I, the First World War, exceptional, or at least too exceptional to be generalized. And what's more, they did not explain how this small minority of actors managed to bypass the majority of rational individuals, which by definition should have prevented the government concerned, the British and the German, to launch the wars. Hobson merely alluded to the role of the press. Listen to this: imperialists exert a control over the body of public opinion through the press. And Schumpeter alluded to the fact that within the administration of the Emperor William II, the different landowners established alliances with other members in order to exert a pressure upon the Emperor. These two ideas somehow will be rediscovered 3 generations later, in 1991, by Jack Snyder in his Myths of Empire. The starting point of Jack Snyder consists in saying that, in asserting and stating empirically, that since the 19th century, different major powers were unable to resist what he would call imperial temptations. That is to say, they were unable to resist the temptation of imperial or imperialist expansion or over-expansion. According to him, this was the case of Great Britain under Queen Victoria in the 19th century, of Imperial Japan during the interwar period, of Imperial Germany at the eve of World War I. It will be the case of post-Stalinist USSR in Africa and in Central Asia, invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the intervention in the Horn of Africa in the 1970s too, and it will be the case for the US, of course, in the Vietnam War. The book was published in 1991. And Snyder ascribes these over-expansionist policies to what he calls the security through expansion myth. The security through expansion myth. That is to say, these wars are justified by the idea that the powers' security, the concerned powers' security, is at stake potentially everywhere on the world political stage. It is a kind of a domino doctrine which is at the root of these over-expansions. Our security is at stake, for instance, in Vietnam, for instance, in India, for the British, for instance, in Afghanistan, for the Soviets, and therefore we have to intervene. But according to Snyder, these arguments are actually merely the rationalization of the propagandistic activities of some imperialist groups who precisely derive interests, parochial interests, sinister interests from the prospective war that they do favor by exerting pressure. They then manage to obtain satisfaction, thanks to what? This is the added value of Snyder, thanks to their superior political resources. And that is to say, they are able to stage collective political action. They profit from some kind of monopolies on information, and they have direct, strong ties to the state. And thanks to this, they are able to hijack the foreign policy decisions that will be taken by the final decision maker, the president in the US, etc., the executive power more generally. First of all, they have superior political resources in the meaning of their ability to organize for collective action. That is to say, they form what Snyder calls log rolling coalitions. We'll come back to a concrete example. They form log rolling coalitions. That is to say, different groups join in the coalition, in the alliance, trading favors so that each group can get what it wants most. Group A joins Group B, and both promise Group A, I will support your what you are looking for if you support what I am looking for. And together, then they will be more powerful. All the more so, the costs of these wars will be borne by all the citizens, who therefore, given the marginal impact upon their material interests, will have no reason to form a collective action against them. So specific groups have a very high expectation of profits thanks to this war, so they exert pressure, they organize themselves collectively, which is not the case of all the individuals who are opposed to the war, but to some extent who do not directly see the negative impact of these wars in the form of raised taxes, for instance, upon their specific personal welfare. The second advantage of these groups is that they have a kind of quasi-monopoly on information, on expertise. Thanks to what? Thanks to their ties to those foreign policy establishment members who put forward the different arguments. in the public sphere. That is to say, the myths of empire are sold to the public opinion by journalists, by think tanks, by different organizations who, of course, are themselves sponsored, funded by these imperialist groups. And third, critical resource of these imperialist groups, they penetrate, I quote Snyder, they penetrate vital sectors of the administrations and thus constrain the decision-making process. The statesman is no longer the prince in the meaning of Machiavelli. Maybe it's too strong to say that he is the prisoner of the different members of his administration, but to some extent, he's at best a kind of manager of a coalition of different groups who all try to impose their will upon the final decision. This somehow is compatible with Graham Allison's bureaucratic politics model. So according to Snyder, of course, it is easier to hijack foreign policy decisions in the cartelized political systems. We could say an autocratic political system, but even in democratic political regimes, it is possible to do so. Why? Because pretty often the decision-making process is secretive, and information is provided only as far to the public opinion, as far as it serves specific interests, either of the government and the groups, or both of them taken together, of course. Jack Snyder published his book in 1991, so absolutely independently from any from America's war in Iraq in 2003. He then summed up and applied it in this article to the then forthcoming war of 2003. What is beyond doubt is that his analysis of 1991 is almost perfectly, as such, applicable to Operation Iraqi Freedom. Operation Iraqi Freedom, indeed, is an imperialist war in the general meaning of a war fought to conquer a foreign territory through the use of military force in order to exert political control upon the country concerned. Saddam Hussein was ousted. America established a provisional government whose policies were controlled, of course, by the American troops, as long as they were present. 150,000 American soldiers and corporate warriors were present. At the elections, of course, which introduced an Iraqi government in June 2004, so roughly 15 months after the war, though it established a nationally elected government, this government could only survive during many years thanks to the presence of American troops. Imperialists as regards the objective pursuit, imperialists also as regards the reason why it was launched. That is to say, the hidden objectives pursued, that is to say, the satisfaction of specific private and therefore sinister interests close to the Bush administration. So the liberal conception of imperialism, of Hobson, of Schumpeter, and of Snyder. Let's deepen this point in the last section of today's lecture. I mentioned some minutes ago, ladies and gentlemen, the incapacity of the White House to justify, to produce any kind of somehow credible evidence to support its claims of the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. When American troops landed in Iraq, they found no weapons of mass destruction. The UN inspectors had never found such weapons of mass destruction. Admittedly, they had been expelled in 1998. American decision makers themselves acknowledged this as early as on May 9, 2003, that is to say, 8 days after the end of Operation Iraqi Freedom, the military operation itself. One of the members, number 2 of the Pentagon, Paul Wolfowitz, we'll come back to him in a few minutes, in an interview given to Vanity Fair, acknowledged that the argument we must prevent Saddam Hussein from acquiring and also from using weapons of mass destruction, this argument was actually chosen because this was the only one which to some extent was likely to create a consensus within the Bush administration. Listen to Wolfowitz. The truth is that for reasons that have a lot to do with the US government bureaucracy, allusion to Allison, the truth is that we settled on the one issue, the one and only issue that everyone could agree on, which was weapons of mass destruction. And to put it differently, Wolfowitz acknowledges that the Bush administration had explicitly lied during the weeks and months preceding the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Leaders lie, ladies and gentlemen, and they lie more to the domestic audience, as shown by John Mearsheimer in his book, Why Leaders Lie, where he also analyzes Bush's decision to go to war. They lie more to domestic audiences than to international partners. If then the existence of weapons of mass destruction was not the main argument, as admitted by the Bush administration itself, we have to look for another reason. And this other reason is what has been called the plan of attack. It is the title of Bob Woodward's book. Bob Woodward is a journalist at the Washington Post. He was one of the 2 journalists together with Carl Bernstein, who had been at the origin of the Watergate scandal in 1970, the beginning of 1970. So there was a plan of attack, actually, that had existed before George W. Bush's administration came to power in 2001. Indeed, as early as in 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, various members of the then George Herbert Bush administration, the father, and notably the then Secretary of State Dick Cheney, and the then Undersecretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz had already tried to convince George Bush the father to get rid of Saddam Hussein. George Herbert Bush, however, had refused to topple Saddam Hussein's regime. Once again in 1998, when Saddam Hussein expelled the UN inspectors, those and the inspectors of the Vienna Agency of International Atomic Energy, whose aim was to control the respect by Saddam Hussein of the weapons embargo that had been imposed upon Iraq in 1991 after Operation Desert Storm. When the inspectors had been expelled, these, the same members of the Republican Party, together with Richard Pearl, with Donald Rumsfeld, we will come back to them, had asked Clinton, who then was the president, I quote, to implement a strategy including military steps for removing Saddam Hussein's from power, from Saddam Hussein's regime from power. So there was a plan of attack, a plan of getting rid of Saddam Hussein, which went back to the beginning of the 1990s. And this is important. Why? Because the same members favorable to an attack against Iraq throughout the 90s became members in Bush's war cabinet, as analyzed by another journalist, James Mann, in his book, The Rise of the Vulcans. If we look at the Bush administration's organization chart, there were 3 groups. of members. On the one hand, we had what can be called the nationalist hawks or the nationalist hardliners, who had started their political career under Ronald Reagan's administration in the 1980s before entering George W. Bush's, the father, administration, and then George W. Bush's, the son, administration. Dick Cheney, vice president under Bush's son, and Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense. A second group was composed by the so-called neo-conservatives, Paul Wolfowitz, number 2 in the Pentagon, and Richard Perle, the head of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board, a group of advisors having direct access to the president. And then we had those who were called pragmatic realists or realist pragmatists, mainly Colin Powell, a Secretary of State. He had been head of the Chiefs of Staffs during Operation Desert Storm in 1990. He was Secretary of State under George Bush the son, and Condoleezza Rice, the head of the National Security Council under George W. Bush. These two realist pragmatists were not opposed to a war as such, but they only accepted a war in the case of a UN resolution. So they wanted to some extent to respect multilateralism. And this is the reason why the two other groups joined in what Snyder calls the log rolling coalition to get rid of Powell and Rice. They formed a coalition. That is to say, they did not have exactly the same vision, but they had some interests that they put together in order to convince George Bush to attack Saddam Hussein, profiting, of course, from the window of opportunity constituted by the terrorist attacks of 9/11. The nationalist hardliners, ladies and gentlemen, I already told this, had started their political career. They had had their first political experiences as politicians, as decision makers under Ronald Reagan's administration. That is to say, during the Cold War. And the Cold War at that time was characterized by the perceived threat of the USSR. So they had a kind of defensive conception of America's exceptionalism. America is different, America is superior, America is exceptional, but we have to defend it first and foremost against the Soviets. The neoconservatives had more offensive conception of America's exceptionalism. Since America became the preeminent hegemonic power after at the end of the Cold War, there was no more a Soviet threat to cope with. They thought that America should profit from this unipolar preeminence to impose its exceptionalism by promoting forcefully its values. So it is possible for America to reshape the world in accordance with America's interests, but also in according to America's values. So ideational interests here were important. And beyond their differences, they had, or the complementary differences, they had one positive complement. There were one positive common point: their eagerness to get rid of Powell and Rice, because they both were opposed to the United Nations. They did not want the US to respect multilateralism. So the terrorist attacks of 9/11 provided the window of opportunity, which permitted them to put their plan of attack into practice, since they had failed both in 1991 and once again in 1998. When we go back to the electoral campaign of 2020, George W. Bush versus Al Gore, who had been the vice president of Bill Clinton, and to some extent who was expected to win the election of November 2020, during this campaign, George Bush as a candidate, George W. Bush as a candidate, had somehow stressed the importance of America adopting a low profile. This was also due to his criticizing as a Republican the Democrat foreign policy consisting in state building, notably in former Yugoslavia. Clinton had intervened in Bosnia and in Kosovo to promote, to defend human rights and to promote democracy. This was criticized by the then Republicans, including George Bush. This is what he said, justifying his idea of America adopting a low profile. If we are arrogant, they, or the other ones, will resent us. And if we are a humble nation, if we adopt a moderate behavior, humble but strong, they will welcome us. So we should not abuse from our political preeminence. We should adopt a low profile. He changed his mind at the latest during the summer of 2002, as indicated by the new national security doctrine, new national security strategy adopted, published in August 2002. This strategy, this security doctrine, explicitly considers the necessity of a preemptive war against rogue states in general and against Iraq in particular. Preemptive was the term used. Actually, it was preemptive. It was preemptive, but in the meaning of preventive, since there was no imminent threat emanating from Iraq. So an evolution in George W. Bush's mind, which is not the proof of his being irrational to some extent. No, this evolution reflects precisely the internal struggle within the administration between the two camps favorable to going to war and the camp opposed, at least to a unilateral war. And in this struggle then, the camp composed by the neoconservatives and the nationalist hawks prevailed over the pragmatic realists. So the war was the implementation of the neoconservative plan of attack, because throughout the 1990s, the major neoconservatives, William Crystal, who was the son of Irving Crystal, who was to some extent the godfather of neoconservatism, former generation, William Crystal and Robert Kagan had published many articles, many analyses, many reports at the head of their think tank Project for a New American Century, where they put forward the idea that America should go to war to spread its values. Listen to this. What's the point of being the greatest, most powerful nation in the world and not having an imperial role? We are the most powerful nation, so we should have an imperial role. The most powerful nation always had an imperial role. I think it would be natural for the United States to play a far more dominant role in world affairs. Not what we are doing now in the 1990s, state building, etc., but to command. We have to command, we have to give orders to what is to be done. So an offensive power, a political behavior. I go on quoting to many the idea that America using its power, the idea of America using its power to promote changes of regime in nations ruled by dictators rings of utopianism. Many people think this will not work. In fact, it is eminently realistic, not realist, realistic, feasible to some extent. There is something perverse in declaring the impossibility of promoting democratic change abroad in the light of what happened in such unlikely places such as the Philippines, Indonesia, Chile, Nicaragua, Paraguay, Taiwan, and South Korea. Democracy prevails in these unlikely places that had been dictatorships before. Why then should it be utopian to imagine a change of regime in a place like Iraq, since it was possible for democracy to prevail in Taiwan, in the Philippines, in Paraguay, etc. It should be easy for democracy to prevail in Iraq, and we therefore should intervene to somehow accelerate this world historical trend, which somehow is compatible with Fukuyama's end of history thesis. Fukuyama, at least during some months and years before changing his mind, was also very close to American neoconservative pundits. So the plan of attack was somehow the concrete implementation of the neoconservatives' political program. The neoconservatives, however, were one of the three major groups within the administration of George Bush. So they managed to obtain satisfaction by establishing a long-rolling coalition with the hardliners, who were not that favorable to regime change in Iraq, which amounts to saying that they were interested in pursuing other concrete objectives. And these concrete objectives were of material nature. That is to say, they were the spokespersons, the representatives of specific materialist, that is to say, economic, private interests within the Bush administration. We have here the top 10 contractors who benefited from both the wars fought in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And the American private firm which earned the most significant part of the profits was KBR, formerly Kellogg Brown and Roots, the construction unit of a multinational firm, Halliburton. Halliburton obtained the main contracts for the reconstruction of Iraq after the Iraqi oil facilities had been destroyed by Operation Iraqi Freedom, as early as on March 25th, 2003, that's to say 1 week after the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom, when the Operation Iraqi Freedom was not over yet. Now it happens that Halliburton's chief executive officer had been, from 1995 to the year 2000, the chief executive officer had been Dick Cheney, who became the vice president of George W. Bush. He, of course, had resigned from his office as a chief executive officer. To put differently, within the Bush administration, Dick Cheney was favorable to this war in order to permit Halliburton, the firm whose chief executive officer he had been until some months before he became vice president, to make huge profits. Donald Rumsfeld, being at the head of the Pentagon, of course, was representative of the US Army's interests in testing new weapons and also in permitting corporate warriors to make a profit. You may know that the American Army, victim of a decrease in military budgets after the end of the Cold War, because there was no more enemy to cope with, there was no more Soviet Union, the American military budget as a percentage of the economic richness decreased, and different tasks that had in the past been carried out by the American Army itself were transferred to contractors, to private firms. And gradually, these private corporate warrior firms to use the term of Peter Singer in his book, to which we'll come back in another chapter. Corporate warriors ended up in having more and more missions, in undertaking more and more tasks, including fighting on the battlefields. So corporate warriors, of course, needed this war. Just as in the past, to come back to Schumpeter, the feudal aristocratic Junkers of the Prussian army needed a new war, World War I, to justify their social privileges. Corporate warriors in the US needed a war to make profits, since a private firm, of course, is based on private profits. So they exerted pressure, and their spokesperson was Donald Rumsfeld. The Bush family itself, Bush the son, Bush the father, had close links to private interest in the oil sector. They came from Texas. The link between oil as a cause for war and the decision to go to war, the link is disputed in the literature. I started reading a very interesting book published 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, Emily Meyerning, The Oil Wars Myth. She does not consider wars likely to be fought for oil as a kind of national security issue, but I think my analysis, or maybe should I say her analysis, is compatible with my analysis of America interested in fighting the war in Iraq for specific oil interests, not for oil as a national economic security interest, but for specific private interests, the oil companies of the US interested in controlling the market of oil extraction in and oil exporting in Iraq. Of course, there was also a close link between the Bush family and different groups that made huge profits thanks to this war. So these different indicators tend to corroborate, the hypothesis of Operation Iraqi Freedom as a sinister war, as an imperialist war. George W. Bush's America, ladies and gentlemen, proved during this war to be a cartelized political system, in the meaning of Snyder, in the meaning of Michael Walzer. What is a cartelized political system? It is a political system who does not respect the separation between different spheres of justice. Michael Walzer's philosophy distinguishes not the traditional separation of powers between executive, legislative, and judicial powers, but spheres of justice. That is to say, the political domain, the economic domain, the judicial domain, and the media domain. In a genuine democracy, these four domains are separated. Every sphere has its specific domain. There is no mixture. Now, in the US, during this war, economic firms were able to exert pressure in the political domain. They were able to put forward their argumentations thanks to the media, who therefore were no longer independent from economic pressure groups, and all the less so since they took their information from the government. So a kind of absence of any of any genuine separation between the different spheres. And indeed, to go into the details, during Operation Iraqi Freedom, the American media did not play their role as somehow a critical voice, which they are supposed to play in the conception of media being the fourth estate critically investigating the validity of the different statements put forward by the politicians in general and the administrations more particularly. American media in general, American TV networks, and more specifically one of them, CNN, not CNN, Fox News, sorry for this confusion. Fox News were the cheerleaders of the George Bush administration. Opinion polls, a look at the opinion polls somehow prove this. In June 2002, that is to say 9 months before Operation Iraqi Freedom was launched, only 20% of Americans were favorable to America going to war alone, whatever, whether there was or not an explicit UN authorization, 20%. In June 2003, that is to say 1 month after the end of the operation, 68%, 68, from 20 to 68, agreed in saying that the US had made the right decision when going to war without any UN resolution. So the American public opinion changed its minds. Such an evolution, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty often ascribed in the so-called Ullman-Lippmann consensus, an allusion to Gabriel Ullman, the political scientist, and Walter Lippmann, a specialist of public opinion in the US during the immediate post-World War II years. A kind of erratic evolution of America's public opinion is ascribed within this Ullman-Lippmann consensus to average American citizens being irrational. That is to say, not being interested in foreign policy and therefore changing their mind, criticizing what they supported the day before, or supporting the day after what they had criticized previously. More recent researches, however, notably the book The Rational Public, published after the end of the Cold War by Benjamin Page and Robert Shapiro, prove that when there are evolutions of the public opinion, the evolution is somehow due to the information to which they are exposed to. And that is to say, American citizens, I guess the same is true for other Western citizens where similar media exist. Citizens change their mind, of course, but they change it on the basis of the information that they receive. So they are not completely stupid to some extent. And when we look at information that were put forward by American media, this is exactly what happened during the months of the crisis preceding the Operation Iraqi Freedom itself. Those American citizens who watched Fox TV were 2 times more likely to believe that there were links between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. They were 1.7 times more likely to believe that Arab countries supported the US. They were 1.6 times more likely to believe that Americans had found weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. To put it differently, they had listened to what American media told them, which amounts to saying that American media were weapons of mass communication, to translate the title of a French book published, and analyzing the role of American media. This was the so-called Fox effect. The Fox effect, that is to say, consisting in a kind of connivance and a kind of collusion between the government and a majority of mainstream media, whose role was to spread what we have to call propaganda by means of fear. That is to say, fear was raised among the American citizens, who then, of course, supported the willingness of the government to go to war in order to put an end to the threat which was considered to be at the origin of the insecurity felt by the American citizens. This Fox effect was not counterbalanced by America's political class, and more specifically by the Democrats. The Democrats did not oppose George Bush's administration and the Republican majority's willingness to go to war. Not one of the more than 30 senators and more than 100 representatives who attended hearings asking the administration to prove that there was a threat emanating from Iraq, etc., not one of the different Democrats challenged the arguments put forward by the Bush administration. To put it differently, George Bush profited what can be called the rally around the flag effect provoked by the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Bush profited from a huge growth in his approval rate. America under attack created a kind of national unity reaction favorable to the president. And he, of course, profited from this context to do what? To ask the different members of the American Congress to authorize him to do whatever pleased, whatever he wanted to do in order to fight both Al-Qaeda and to fight him who he considered to be an ally of Al-Qaeda, Saddam Hussein. In November 2002 were midterm elections. Midterm elections were organized, and the Democrats ran the risk of being defeated if ever they dared not to support George W. Bush's decision to go to war. So he asked the American Congress to adopt a resolution which authorized Bush, I quote, to use the armed forces of the US as he determines to be necessary. He determines. That is to say, there was a kind of blank check given by the US representatives, senators, and members of the House of Representatives, permitting Bush to do whatever he wanted to do. He just needed to invoke the threat emanating from Iraq in order to do what he had decided to do. The preeminence of the executive power, to which we will come back in another chapter. To put it differently, last argument, ladies and gentlemen, America's democracy stopped working like a genuine democracy during the crisis and during the war. I fought against Iraq in 2003. Maybe this was due to the kind of hubris, the kind of arrogance which sometimes characterizes democracies. Because of what? Because of their conviction that they benefit from an inherent military superiority, permitting them to easily win the wars what they fight. This is what we will have a look at in our chapter 5, the Western culture of carnage at the origin of many of today's Western wars. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending today's class. Have a great day. See you again next week. Goodbye.